It's my delight to now announce that the next panel session will be focusing on just that conversation. And the chair for this panel is Kadi, who is a researcher here at the London School of Economics and Politics and a PhD candidate focusing on the developmental impact of China Digital Silk Road in North Africa, particularly in Egypt and Algeria. Our work examines how Chinese digital capital influences technological upgrading and standard diffusion in host countries' ICT ecosystems. She has consulted for a number of organizations, including the World Bank, and she is currently the Associate Fellow at Chatham House, Middle East and North Africa Program. She previously worked on North-South knowledge, production, and data-driven innovation here at LSE. She is a Chatham scholar. Chatham scholars in the house. She is one of you, and also holds an MSc in Development Studies, also here from LSE, and a BA in Politics from SOAS. A very rich profile, and she will be chairing this panel. Ladies and gentlemen, join me to welcome Kadi for a panel.
Hi, everyone.
Yeah. Oh my guys. Appreciate it. I really don't like sitting.
Hi, everyone. It's really nice to see all of you here. Thanks for joining us and sticking around on a sunny Sunday afternoon. It's really nice to see many of you here. So in this panel, we're going to talk about the ambitious Agenda 2063 that was mentioned earlier. So for those of you who are not familiar with the agenda, it's the AU's framework for transforming the African continent. And I think there was a speaker earlier who asked, why is it 2063? And that's mainly because it marks the anniversary, like the century of the African Union's creation. It was created in the aftermath of independence in 1963. And the framework was decided in 2013, and it gave a 50-year vision on how the continent could be transformed economically, socially, on various aspects. And so to have this very exciting discussion, we have a fantastic panel, an all-female panel of experts who will discuss this. So we'll start with introducing Maureen Sigauke, who's an Atlantic Fellow for Social and Economic Equity and a community organizer. She's a proud Zimbabwean community organizer and activist committed to driving grassroots change through education, environmental justice, and youth empowerment. Just next to her, we have Aisha Abdelaziz, who's an Atlantic Fellow for Social and Economic Equity and is an energy access specialist. She's a Kenyan energy specialist with over 15 years of experience advancing clean, affordable, and sustainable energy solutions across Eastern and Southern Africa. And last but not least, we have the chance to have Yaa Ofori-Ansah, who's a multi-award-winning Africa travel and tourism specialist. She's an entrepreneur and founder of Talking Drums, a sustainability-focused Africa travel company, and the Talking Drums agency, a VIP brand and talent management agency. Well, give me a warm round of applause to our speakers before we start. Amazing. So I guess we're going to start with you, Moanki, if you want to kickstart the discussion.
So I know it's right at the end of the panel, and it's usually known as the dead zone. But what we're going to do, and what we discussed behind the scenes, was that how do we liven it up, right? So we're going to make this quite interactive. And the first thing that we did was to ask ourselves, where do we want to start talking from, right? And the idea was to kind of have a feel in the room in terms of how familiar with African Union Agenda 2063, right? So I'm going to do a little poll. So if you are sleeping or you're next to someone who's praying, nudge them and say, there's a poll that's about to get down. Can we get in the mix? Yeah. So how many SDGs are there in the Sustainable Development Goals agenda? How many? Just shout from where you're at. How many? 17, right? How many goals are there in the AU 2063 agenda? Okay, next question. Now it gets interesting. How many people have read it or interacted with it? Show of hands. I love the hands I'm seeing right up at the back. Yeah. So we did a good job. We did well. When we said, let's not start by assuming whether people understand. So allow me to use the next 25 minutes to unpack the agenda. And this is just a summary of it, right? So I love what you said. Kiro, I was hoping he's here. In 2013, the African Union was celebrating 50 years of existence from 2063. And as we were celebrating, and I say we because I'm proudly African, yeah. As we were doing that, we then decided that, so what is going to be our ambition or aspiration for the next 50 years? And that's how the 2063 agenda came into being. So in terms of, it's highly aspirational, but in terms of implementation, it is broken down in chunk size of 10-year periods of implementation, yeah? So you'd find that the first year of implementation the first 10 years ran from 2013 and ended in 2024. And in each epoch, there is a very clear description of what should be achieved in line with the 7 goals. So next time you're in a space, how many goals are there for the AU 2063 agenda? There are 7 aspirations and 20 goals. Got it? Yeah? What are the 7 goals? Yeah, there's quite a lot, but we start talking about a prosperous Africa being one of the aspirations. Another aspiration is about an inclusive development for Africans. And Yaa, who asked a question in the last panel, was talking about where are the people that are found on the periphery. But according to the agenda, the idea is for the development to be inclusive. Yeah. The other aspiration around that was talking about integrated Africa, where some of the discussions that we talked about yesterday about regional integration leading into some panel discussions earlier on Pan-Africanism are some things that we look at. So 7 aspirations, 20 goals. But you also need to know that there are 15 distinct projects that should be undertaken and implemented under the African Agenda 2063. And some of them were coming out through the panels from yesterday to today. The silencing, have you ever heard of silencing the guns by 2030? Yeah, that's a project that is part of the 2063 agenda, yeah? The idea there is that guns should be silenced by 2030. Another project that is distinct to the 2063 agenda is the African Continental Free Trade Agreement, and I know we've been talking about it throughout the past 2 days. We've also have you ever heard about the Pan-African E-University? So under the 2063 agenda, there was a vision which said, you know what, we need to create academic institutions that are enshrined on Pan-African ideologies that seek to, build a united Africa, and that's the project that needs to be done under Agenda 2063. Another interesting project that falls under Agenda 2063 is the One Africa passport, where I know each and every one of you sitting in this room are very familiar about the horrors, the challenges that we face when we talk about travel across the region, but also travel beyond the region. And the idea is there to create an Africa where people can freely travel. You'd love that, wouldn't you? I can see from the look of your face you would. Another agenda that is there, can you imagine under the 2063 agenda we have an Africa out of space strategy? And I know a lot of people then tend to critique the 2063. Why I'm talking about this is that when my other panelists are going to start talking, they're going to be talking about what has been happening, what hasn't been happening, what needs to happen. But most of the times I've seen that we always critique the agenda based on the fact that we do not actually understand what it is. Yeah? Very elaborate again in terms of what is there is the highest and the integrated railway system. Yesterday, there was someone, in case you were not there was someone who was saying, but we can't, the African Continental Free Trade Agreement cannot be successful if we do not have a supporting infrastructure and transport system. And under the 2063 agenda, there's the vision of creating not just a train system, but a high-speed train system that cuts across Cape Town to what? To Cairo. So why I'm talking about all of this is that I think that now when we're going to start talking about what has happened, we need to adopt that lens of understanding of what the agenda says, what it seeks to achieve in the first 10 years and the next 10 years until 50 years is up. The next question when somebody would ask me about the agenda is, so how is it supposed to be implemented? Yeah? So it does have an implementation framework. So when you read the African Agenda 2063, you must look for its implementation matrix so that you are very clear on what needs to be done, when it must be done, what success looks like. Yeah? It also comes with a very robust monitoring and evaluation framework, which is hinged on multi-level monitoring mechanisms. So when we start monitoring performance of the Agenda 2063, it is done at an AU level, but it also trickles down to implementation and monitoring at a regional economic grouping level, and it cascades down to a national level, but it doesn't stop there. And this is where it gets interesting for a community organizer such as myself. You also are supposed to monitor and implement the African agenda at a local community level. And that's why I think for myself, I've been personally invested in understanding, because if I'm part of the architecture of its implementation, I really then should know. Right? So what has been there? So the AU, using the different mechanisms, has produced a couple of reports that if you are interested, you can look up. So in terms of evaluation mechanisms, we know that you evaluate mid-term, you evaluate end of term. So mid-term in 2021, there was the second continental report that outlined what progress had been achieved, what hadn't been achieved, and some challenges that were faced. Why I think I wanted to belabor on this is because most of the times, if we're going to move forward with the agenda, it's important for us to do so from a point of information and cease and desist from talking about this agenda and providing critique to our various governments from a point where we actually are not so sure what the agenda means. And my prayer, if I then end, is for people to be as conversant with the agenda as much as they're conversant with the SDGs. Everybody knew that we had 17 goals. So my prayer and hope is that when I come in maybe a couple of layers later, everybody will be saying seven aspirations, 20 goals, and 15 projects, because then we can start having meaningful conversations. So I just want to leave it there before we can get into the other discussions, if that's okay.
Excellent. That was a wonderful introduction to what the agenda is. Aisha, the floor is yours.
Good afternoon, everyone. Oh, guys.
I told you.
Okay, let's try it one more time. Good afternoon. I'm going to sing a line from a song, which I hope you know. Then you finish it for me. Emancipate yourself from mental slavery. Are we waking up? Emancipate yourself from mental slavery. None of us can free our minds. Okay. I'm not the best singer, but I tried a little bit, and then you guys did very well. So, whose agenda is it? Is my question, hence the song. So let's think about that for a minute. Kiru from the previous panel said in 2063 he will be slightly over 60. So without getting into all our respective ages and your ages, let's think about that for a moment. So this is about a group of people who sat together in 2013 and came up with a vision. Visions are amazing. Someone said yesterday in a different panel, for those who aren't here, that what was the line?
Many visions are good. Visions are good.
Visions are good, but when you have too many visions, then you're hallucinating. So this is a line he heard from somewhere else, and I found that quite interesting. So when I reflect on having a vision, I think it's useful in the sense that it creates a shared perspective, a shared direction, a shared imagination of where we want to go. With Agenda 2063, I think it gets that little bit more complicated because of its intent to be intergenerational. So, people worked on this in 2013. At that point in time, of course, they were reflecting on their experience, their expertise, but also they were daring to think about the future for Africa in a very Pan-Africanist way. There is a monitoring report document that has been published, and it looks at the results in terms of what were the goals and how far did African governments go to move the needle on that. So it's something I think is in the public domain, and I would like also to encourage you to read it. But I can summarize what it's about. So in general, you see that the anticipated targets were not fully met, right? Some progress was made, but even where progress was made, it wasn't to the level that was anticipated, right? So that also shows there is a slower rate of making progress in these indicators. So when you do have a chance to look at the indicators, you can see for every specific one how far the needle moved. I'll just highlight a couple, which for me are I think, the heart of the issue. So, of course, the goal indicators include the GDP. And there you see that there was some change, but it was very modest. So it was lower than expected. If you look at unemployment, it is worsening. So far more people are unemployed now than previously when these goals were being set. If you look at indicators like inequality, inequality reduced, so that's something positive, but it did not reduce as much as was expected. So all in all, there has been a lot of success and a lot of progress. However, the critics would argue that where there have been gains, they've not been as much as we thought. And then we have some indicators that have worsened. So, for example, a very interesting one is poverty, where a fewer proportion of people in African countries experience poverty. So there's improvement, but then it was lower than expected. But of course, there are some sort of interesting indicators which actually improved, such as access to internet and use of internet, etc. So why am I saying all this? That I think what we all know from making plans is that a lot of plans are subject to what happens when they enter. Because a plan is only as good as, and then what? You have a plan, you implement it, and then you have to observe the trends, and then you have to adopt. So for me, I'd like to reflect on that for a couple of minutes, which is, whose agenda is it? And what are individuals and groups doing about increasing their ownership of this agenda? Because remember, the people that sat in 2013, the people that are sitting now, have that need to focus on the continuity of these plans, but also they need to adjust so that we learn from it, and then we can imagine a different future based on what we know today that we didn't know in the past. So from a lot of the interventions that we've had in the last 2 days, I think there is, I forget the lady's name. There are some bubbles of comments that show me that we are owning the agenda. Someone earlier said, is this about youth becoming politicians, right? Because she was thinking about, I need to be part of this process and I need to get something done. So she said, maybe it's about youth getting into politics. A couple of days ago, I was in other discussions where people were saying, is this about accountability? Is it about governance and democracy? Do we just want more visibility? So I will end my comments by leaving that question to you, right? If you dare to think of yourself as pro-Africanist, and therefore you see yourself as part of that agenda, it's yours. It's up to you to see what's not working in it, but also it's up to you to step out, and participate in shaping its evolution. Because for me personally, from my point of view, as I've said, plans change, plans need to change. And this is one of those plans which will only succeed if it adopts, if it changes, if it's dynamic. A very important part of that movement is, of course, the youth. Yesterday I had a chance to interact with, I see you, Lem. I met a Lem, Leto from South Africa, Justice, Lisa, Lina, right? I think Agenda 2063 is yours, and it's for the next generation, all right? So I leave you with that. As we hear the comments and as we, pass on to Yaa to speak, and then as we come back to the questions that Tin has put together, I would like to invite you into this space where you also bring your own thoughts, bring your critiques, bring your idea. Imagine yourself as being in the driver's seat of where do you want this to go? What is the critique? Where is it not working? What do you want to do? Yesterday, there were a couple of questions about, for example, the DRC and that awareness of conflict in DRC, an awareness of, trying to understand what's the issue in that country. Why is the conflict being sustained? So for me, after sleeping on that question yesterday, then my ask today was, hey, if I saw the gentleman here, I've not seen him, my question for him would be, are you going to write a thesis about this topic? Because now I'm trying to think of, okay, what can I do? What can you do? So that we learn, we understand, and then we explore, and then we resolve these issues. Because otherwise, I think he would leave this LSE Africa Summit without a resolution to the problem. So if someone is not resolving the issue, are you the person that's going to give it a try and resolve it? And with that, I'll stop there.
Excellent. Thanks a lot, Aisha, for those thoughts and insights. I'm going to give the floor to Yaa now for explaining what you're doing in your sector and how the agenda is playing out in tourism.
Thank you so much. So my perspective of Agenda 2063 is coming from a business owner. So I have a background in sustainability, ESG, and trade. And when I developed my travel company, I had the intention that I wanted it to have a focus on sustainability, but essentially, what does that mean in practice? So the Agenda 2063 and the Sustainable Development Goals were frameworks that I used in able to help me build the business, looking at the goals, the aspirations, the targets, and the indicators. So if I take a step back, my company is called Talking Drums. It's a sustainable focused Africa travel company. We help people travel Africa with ease. We help people plan their own trips. We host trips. And we also have a marketplace where we sell products from across Africa and bring them to you. For Talking Drums, tourism is a gateway to business and investment. And it also helps dispel or demystify the continent of Africa. So helping people to travel Africa shows them that actually maybe the things that they saw as barriers were not necessarily the case, or there would be solutions to barriers. So, for example, we know that it's difficult for Africans to travel within Africa in comparison to non-Africans. So you find that there would, from my business perspective, I have a lot of demand of customers from outside of the continent. So I wanted to see how I could change that. Why am I not getting more demand from customers from within the continent? And it's for things like lack of freedom of movement. So Agenda 2063, and especially the African Continental Free Trade Agreement, was crucial for me because it was going to help my business open up to the whole continent, to 1.2 billion people, versus looking at it from a country-to-country perspective. But also the aspiration of an African Union passport, or the aspiration of visa-free travel for all countries across the continent, would mean that my business would have more opportunities. We'll probably come back to this a bit later, but even though we've heard we've heard a lot around this African Union passport that has been delayed, but on the flip side, you see countries empowering themselves to take these decisions separately. So there are countries who have announced visa-free entry for all African citizens, but the number's actually only six countries, and that's if you include Kenya, because some people dispute if Kenya should be included, because although they announced it's visa-free for Africa and then the whole world, it's actually now a visa waiver. So we'll include Kenya for this discussion. So 6 countries, but that's 6 out of 54. It's usually easier for people on non-African passports to travel to different African countries. And then in addition to that, the cost of travel is very high. So another thing that drew me to the agenda is the focus on building infrastructure, because I'm sure most of us know intra-Africa travel can be quite difficult. It can be cheaper to fly from an African country to Europe or the other way, and I see people nodding in agreement, than from other countries in Africa. For example, the other day I was looking at a one-way flight to Morocco. So from London to Morocco, I could get a one-way flight for about £39. From Accra, so this is from London to Marrakesh. From Accra to Marrakesh, does anyone want to take a guess on how much a one-way ticket? Close. Lower. It was 500, but that was for one way. So the focus that the agenda has on infrastructure, from a personal and from a business perspective, for me is very important, because it should help to reduce the cost of travel. And also, when I developed Talking Drums, the focus was also on economic development. How can we actually contribute to the economy? In particular, the local economy, because what I found is that a lot of countries were rightly so diversifying their economies, which again links to the agenda. But what I found was that some countries who were now looking to diversify and use tourism to do so were at a place where everything was becoming really centralized. So if I take my beautiful homeland Ghana as an example, I'll critique, but I'll provide a solution. I found that even though across the last 5 years there's been a real push towards tourism, it's becoming really centralized to one time of year, which is in December. And within December, it's becoming really centralized to particular areas of the capital, Accra. So whilst you're seeing this growth in tourism and you're seeing these headlines, Ghana had record-breaking number of tourism of tourists in this particular year, how much of that is actually filtering down to the average person? Africa has the highest rates of entrepreneurship. How many of those entrepreneurs are actually benefiting from this increased tourism? So through Talking Drums, we try as much as possible to work with local businesses and entrepreneurs, and also aligning to the agenda. We are specifically looking at how we can either work with local businesses, entrepreneurs, or help with that job creation element as well. So from a private sector perspective, something like Agenda 2063 can be really beneficial in helping you in terms of developing your business, but creating solutions to the aspirations and goals of the agenda.
Excellent. Thank you so much. Thank you to the three of you for these very insightful points. I think that, I'm going to use my privileged position as a moderator to ask my questions first. So, we hear a lot that the whole Agenda 2063 is about finding African solutions to African problems and African challenges, and it's all about, ownership, like our own path towards development and prosperity. I was wondering, Yaa and Maureen, if you could talk to the extent to which there was conversation and inclusion of both the private sector for you, Yaa, and activist groups and community level groups in drafting the program and also in its implementation now.
You want to go first? Yeah. Go first. Okay. So as you start talking about how inclusive was the process leading to that, I want to pause there and go back to the question that we have to speak to. And first say, the question about is it a dream or a reality, I would say that every person has to dream. And at a continental level, we must have aspirations. So the question is it a dream or reality? I think we must have a dream that embodies the collective aspirations as a body. But we also need to highlight that it's a hard dream, that must be converted into reality. So I don't think it's a question of whether it's a dream or it's a reality. As a continent, we need to have a shared dream that we must actualize and convert into a reality. But it's challenging, and part of the challenging aspect which you're talking about, to what extent were people included? We are 54 states, each with sovereign aspirations as well. So Zimbabwe, Kenya, Ghana, we all have our different and divergent national interests, right? So bringing that to a fore and saying, how do we come up with a common and shared vision? That in itself is an odious task. But what then happened as we were leading into the development of that is that through the AU Commission, there are structures that allow civil society organizations like where I'm coming from to also input directly at an AU level. But it doesn't stop there. If you're a civil society organization working in Zimbabwe, if you're an activist, there should be ways and mechanisms through your government interventions for you to infiltrate and be able to influence policy from a bottom-up approach. But sadly, and I like the fact that the AU has been very honest about the state of how that is played out, sadly, the community voices have been missing in the discussion. Yeah? And part of it is in the reason of pre-existing deficits within our continent. At a national level, let's talk about, so the agenda exists within the pretext of existing political culture across the continent. So if I was to speak about Zimbabwe, one of the prevalent characteristics of our political culture is exclusion, right? So you've got a continent, we've got a country of a majority of its citizens being young, but the parliament has got less than 30% of young people making decisions at that macroeconomic level. So of course, when you start talking about who then set the agenda for the 2063 agenda from a bottom-up approach, it was exclusionary right from a national level. You know, so and I love the fact that then it presents an opportunity for us in this discussion, which I'm really keen to hear from the rest of you, to say, how can we redress that? Because at the end of the day, it seems like when you say, whose agenda is it? Who's speaking? And I think from where I'm sitting, the young people have been excluded, and yet Africa is regarded as a what? As a young continent, yeah? Africa, the women are excluded, right? And when you look at the report, they said progress insofar as inclusion, which is aspiration number 8, still was at about 38%. That's too low if we're going to be talking about people-driven development. So I think, yeah, the fault lines are mimicking already existent crevices and deficits within our political architecture, social and exclusion cultures that we embody through our patriarchal practices. So from where I'm standing, there is tokenism insofar as who's included, but the young people, the people that are marginalized, people living with disabilities, are really not on the agenda, and we really need to look at that as well.
I think the only thing I would add is that in the past, when some of these frameworks were developed, if I think back to the Millennium Development Goals, they were developed in line with just the governments only, whereas now lots of these frameworks or agendas have the private sector in mind or work hand in hand with them. There's lots around sustainability and ESG. And similarly with Agenda 2063, which is why I think there is this specific trade focus with the African Continental Free Trade First Agreement, now area. And one of the main things being around reducing barriers to trade. How can we increase trade? Trade itself being a gateway to economic prosperity. So I think that it's more collaborative with business, but to your point, what about civil society? What about the average person? What about communities? How accessible is the information to them so that they can empower themselves to challenge any development? Are there data gaps? How are these being plugged? So I think that gap needs to be closed.
Excellent, thanks a lot. Aisha, I have a question for you. So, I mean, I guess all of us in this room, both Africans and non-Africans, are like concerned about the situation, the security situation and the conflicts on the continent. Actually, one of the key aims of Agenda 2063 was to achieve peace across the continent by 2020 and obviously we're looking at the situation in Sudan and the DRC we're far from achieving that. Aisha, I know that you've been working on inequality, and we know that inequality has been theorized largely in the academic literature as a key driver for conflict. What are your thoughts about that? We know that on the continent we still have some of the most unequal countries in the world are on the African continent. What can be done to reduce inequality and conflict?
I think I'd have to be a genius very quickly in order to respond to that question in any way that attempts to resolve the issue or sort of leave you with something that you can go with and then do it and then it happens. For me, just as a question, I think it's interesting just simply because, as if you remember from my starting comments, what do the indicators show? That inequalities have reduced, right? At an African continental level. So the first challenge, I think, is that by establishing a shared vision and therefore shared indicators, you need to have to aggregate pieces of the problem that each has been resolved in order for the problem to be resolved. So, for instance, what do the indicators show for Agenda 2063? One is that inequalities has reduced, so that's sort of a positive movement. Sorry. And then the other indicator you have is the ongoing incidences of armed conflicts in the African continent, which has also reduced, right? So the problem then is slightly different. It's not the number of conflicts, it's not inequality, at least it's not those two things by themselves. It's the fact that you have dynamics within the country, within the country's borders, and within regions, within countries that are within proximity of each other. So many things are at play, and these things have to be better understood in order for conflicts to actually be resolved. So yesterday, I don't know who, sorry, please, who was here yesterday? So that okay. Some people weren't here, so at least for you guys, it's it's new information, right? So examples of issues that were raised yesterday by people in the audience. I had mentioned earlier DRC, and the question there was there's ongoing conflict, and we had a panel which had people working in the mining sector. So from that panel, my understanding was there is dependence on natural resources. So that is an issue, right? So in a way, Agenda 2063 is trying to paint a vision of an African continent where there's reduced dependency on parts of the economy that are linked to conflict, right? There were also other discussions around winners and losers. So, and that's why I said, someone should do a thesis on this, which was about trying to understand who benefits from situations where there is conflict. Because for the conflict, in the words of the person who was in the audience, for the conflict to continue, there have to be some incentives that are incentivizing the conflict, otherwise it will stop. So that's also an interesting thing to keep in mind. So conflict is complicated. Conflict, has many losers because we are thinking of loss of life, loss of livelihoods, loss of future generations, loss of home. We know a lot of refugees are struggling. We know there's a lot of internally displaced persons. But what needs also to be much more understood in order for anyone to intervene is the drivers of the conflict and the way that these conflicts are interconnected within the countries. Because another part of the issue is that of course, with any conflict, there is a risk of civil war. So sometimes you can have a war that continues and outlives the starting point, right? So years later, nobody is quite focusing on what the triggers were, but then the conflict is continuing. So it's a very complicated space. From my point of view, I think it's a space that needs far more exploration and sort of discourse and understanding. And the reason is because, which is a bit tangential, but if you're a fan of reading, then you can look at a lot of literature on the African continent that's much more historical. And what the literature shows is most conflicts are not happening for the first time, right? I think I can see lots of nodding. A lot of the conflict in African countries is recurrent. So if you go sort of long enough in history, you see there was something a couple of years ago, there was something 15 years ago, something 20 years ago. But what also it should tell us in terms of looking at Agenda 2063 is we should anticipate that conflict remains a possibility unless there are active measures to resolve the underlying issues that drive that conflict. And that's why my emphasis, I'll double down on the same point, is we need to better understand the drivers. We need to intervene on those drivers, even when indicators tell us otherwise. So it's about what's under the surface. So things I can think about at the moment, for instance, is just cross-referencing the different data sets that you're getting from Agenda 2063 reports. So for instance, on one hand, you have youth unemployment. Is that potentially something that you want to be concerned about, future conflict? Would that be a driver or not? And then you look at other things like, just thinking differently. The other data set which I found quite raises a lot of questions around what the future holds is enrollment of children into preschool. So, right now we need to know, looking at the current data sets, that without any interventions, we are looking at a future generation that has far lower rates of literacy because of the intakes that are going into the preschools, and all these things are low. So are these things that we should be concerned? Are these things I'm concerned about? Are these things that we should be addressing? Of course, at a basic human level, purely for improving quality of life, but also in terms of anticipating worst-case scenarios. Are these some of the things that will, on aggregate, create a situation where the African continent is not moving towards prosperity and peace because of certain aspects of the society not being quite prosperous, I think, for individuals and for societies, for communities, for countries, and then for regions. Yeah.
Absolutely. Thanks a lot. Yeah, it's definitely a very complex issue, and it will take a lot of thoughts from all of us moving forward. Well, I have many more questions for the three of you, but I think it's time to open up the floor to questions. So, in the audience, maybe start with the gentleman over there.
Hello. Yeah, thank you very much for the opportunity. My name is Tunde. I'm a physician who works in research for drug development. And I have had the pleasure of perusing the document 2063 before today. So my question is to the entire panel, including the moderator, please. I want to focus on building a bridge between the dream and the reality. So do we have a coordinating and safeguarding office at the AU for the flagship projects of this agenda? And I want to illustrate. So we speak, one of the flagship projects is the Grand Inga Dam, which is supposed to generate about 40,000 megawatts of energy. This is vaunted as a silver bullet solution to our energy problems in Africa. However, as we speak, there's an Australian firm which is talking to our Congolese brothers about building the dam, using it to generate green hydrogen, and then exporting that green hydrogen. So we have an extant situation where we are thinking or envisioning 2063, which comes back to the question, who owns the agenda? But there is an exotic interlocutor who literally wants to cannibalize the goose that would lay the golden egg. That's on the part of safeguarding the flagship project. And then finally, when it comes to coordination, so COVID happened, we all learned the lesson, nobody's giving you vaccines anytime soon. So now you can already see linguistic divisions in attempts to make vaccines. The French-speaking parts of Africa Senegal, Morocco have their Institut Pasteur, Ghana has its own, Nigeria, Rwanda, etc. Who is coordinating to make sure that we don't end up infighting excess capacity without people to offtake, and therefore make sure that we don't end up fighting amongst ourselves? Thank you.
Maybe let's take 2 more questions before we start answering. We have a hand up here.
Thank you very much. I have quite a specific question. It's the question for Yaa. I was kind of intrigued when you talked about this kind of success story of Ghana's tourism industry, but you talked about it being really concentrated in one time of year. And my question is whether that is because foreign tour operators have pushed this? Because I presume it's not very sustainable for like businesses in Ghana to only have one time of year when they're paying salaries. And to kind of connect it back to sort of broader themes, you know, it kind of reminds me of the way in which commodity dependence for African economies is very cyclical and means that African countries go through boom and bust, which isn't very good for state building and learning. So I'm wondering if there's something interesting about the way that African regional trade integration provides some kind of stability for markets and stability for businesses to kind of accumulate and learn. So I just wanted to specifically ask you to, like, why is that the case? Is it because it's dominated by foreign actors who have, you know, different parts of the world at different times of year, and what the impact is for domestic businesses? Thanks.
Thanks a lot. Well, there's another question here.
Thank you very much. My name is Lem, as you heard earlier. My question is kind of, does there need to be a bigger push to kind of make the agenda known at, like, from a primary school level? Because, you know, even I see the UN SDG goals like 10 times a day when I'm back home in Kenya or Tanzania at every office, because, like, I don't know how many UN agencies there are. But, like, I've only really heard of the 2063 agenda, like, in this past year, but it's been there since 2013. So there needs to be a massive push, especially to government actors, but also to, like, private sector, business leaders, entrepreneurs, as they have arguably a massive, you know, stake in making this a reality, you know, in terms of the infrastructure, the connections. If we're to have a low-fare airline that flies within Africa, that's going to be probably, you know, something that's going to be better run if it's private, you know, than state-owned, you know, could be argued, which is better. But so does there need to be a bigger push to get this taught in our schools, in, you know, universities, to be African leaders to say, you know, during election campaigns, mention this as part of something that they're doing more? Yeah.
That's a great comment. We were actually discussing this when we were preparing the panel. Like, not that many people on the continent know about this agenda. Well, we have a fantastic set of questions. Thanks a lot. Who wants to start? Should we start with the first question?
It's okay. So apparently, now you see why I didn't want to sit next to the coordinator, to the moderator, because then I'm left with no choice.
So I will make sure.
So I'm going to respond first, Tunde, to your question, and I think as I respond to that, it will also speak to Lem's question. So I'll tell you what the problems, according to a community activist perspective, or a community mobilizer's perspective. So first and foremost, so like I said, there's an implementation plan. When you read it, it's amazing, right? But in terms of implementation, the issues of resources supporting the implementation becomes a huge thing, right? So the Grand Inga Dam, for instance, is something that the AU was supposed to be one of the flagship projects that we were supposed to do under the Agenda 2063. After the end of 10 years, we're supposed to have already seen a foundation, you know, of that bridge done, and nothing of that sort is really happening. And I think it's important to realize that the vision is anchored in our problems, pre-existing problems, which also speak to, do we have the resources to support that? And what you then have, if you do not have the resources to support that, are beautiful projects that you can actualize because you do not have the money to do that, right? And the same thing applies to what you're talking about in terms of communication. So you can read the agenda with the communication strategy, which talks about the intention about how we're going to make jingles out of it. So it's there in the communication plan, but you've got to have the resources to support that, right, for instance. So I think, yes, there needs to be a bigger push, but we must be able, for every action, unfortunately, you know, when your mom told you that, be a good child, don't love money. She was wrong. Money makes the world go round, right? So all these aspirations that we have, as long as we do not have the resources to support that, it becomes a problem. But the other thing is also, we need to also talk about, remember the political culture that I talked about in terms of the region. Do we love each other? Do we integrate? Do regional groupings, Tunde, speak to each other? ECOWAS, let's talk about the various conflicts that have happened. You've got regional groups that choose not to talk about certain conflicts because they're like, you know what? It's not our issue. But we all know that it affects all the aspirations that we have as a collective. So the political, fragmentation of what Africa is becomes something that takes away from that. So I might want to, for instance, communicate, but somebody will feel like, you know what, that's a Zimbabwean problem. You know, so I'm not going to be part of it. So the report that she's even talking about, only 38 out of 54 countries have been producing data in terms of progress, right? That shows you, that speaks volumes. So yeah, I think it also builds on the fact that we are a fragmented continent, and it takes away from our ability to then realize common and shared vision, if it is common at all. Because that's where I always then land. Whose vision is it? Right? Because some people are not coming to the party. And then I also talk about the challenge of coordination. So we do have coordination mechanisms, Tunde, at an AU level, the Commission, but again, it speaks to the ability to then provide oversight and then be able to then say, if you are found accountable and you're not doing what you're supposed to have been doing, how do you bring people to account? How do you ensure that people are able to then say, I ratified, and you actually do? So what I think is lacking from a coordination perspective is the, what if we find that you are party to Agenda 2063, but actually then going back and sitting back without doing anything. So there is no form of transparency, not transparency, accountability measures, because we respect sovereignty so much that you cannot come into my corridor and tell me what it is that I do. So those are some of the things that I think take away from coordination, that take away from our ability to talk about what it is that we need to do, but at the same time also talk about how can we popularize it. But the big push, it really needs to be there. And it's important that from this discussion, now that you know, you also locate yourself and say, what is it that I can do? Because if a community organizer can know this much, I think everybody should. And then we can push our governments from the bottom up. Yeah. I don't know if it makes sense, Sam. Sort of. Yeah, I feel it.
Just if I could quickly add on that point about, you know, how we're supposed to be more economically integrated now with the African Free Trade Agreement, but when you look at it in practice and from my own research, often when it comes to big foreign investors, you end up just having a race to the bottom between different African countries competing. So I studied China's Belt and Road Initiative in Africa, and you see that, you know, I'm Algerian, and Algeria would compete with Morocco on like who gets the funding to build this new big port for like, you know, helping Chinese trade to the EU using free trade agreements and all of that. So far we're still very much in like a framework of competition, and I haven't seen like, I mean, maybe there's a need to rethink this institutionally and how to really create incentives for countries to engage in like regional blocs in a more comprehensive way. But so far, we've just been seeing a race to the bottom. But when you think about it in this big context of like the rise of Trump and the retreat of multilateralism, African countries ought to really come together and cooperate more as a continent. You had a question from Laura.
Yes, Laura, thank you. Great question. So really brief background. So December has traditionally been a popular time in Ghana because those in the diaspora would return home. Most people have more holidays around December, kind of time off from work. Lots of people have weddings during that time. Christmas is a big celebration, especially Boxing Day. So it was always popular. However, in 2019, the government decided to launch a year-long campaign that culminated in December in Ghana, and that attracted a lot of tourists from the US. And I think a lot of countries, especially those who are trying to diversify their economies and move towards tourism, are really chasing the US dollar in terms of tourists. And so it culminated in, once that year was complete and December became more popular than they envisaged, the government then decided that they would launch a December in Ghana campaign, which is great, but there are 11 other months in the year. So the problem is it's now been so focused on December that, for example, for me, if I try and promote traveling to Ghana to my clients outside of December, I get pushback from people who are like, they want to wait until December. I'd say that for me, I think that for those countries who are really trying to push tourism as part of their economic plans, they can look to other countries who have more established sectors, such as Kenya, for example. Kenya has kind of a tiered pricing system, so they're really great with domestic tourism. So, and Tanzania as well. So there's a lot of domestic tourism, so citizens can also benefit. They're not priced out of visiting, exploring the country. And then they have the regional pricing, and then you have the international pricing. Some people don't like that. They feel it's a bit exclusive, it excludes those, or there's a two-tiered pricing system, and those who maybe have a stronger currency can take it personally. But I just think, I actually see it as it makes it more accessible to kind of the average citizen. There's also another solution is promoting more domestic tourism, because local citizens act as ambassadors to a country. So if everyone is coming to your city, but you've kind of really, there's that education piece around why tourism can benefit, then actually a local citizen can just say to someone, I mean, you're here in Accra, what do you mean you're spending your whole time here? Why don't you, go and venture out to another city? And then I also think a lot of governments underestimate both domestic tourism but also regional tourism. So Ghana receives a lot of visitors from Nigeria, for example. But as I say, there has been this push towards the American dollar, and I think there's been an increase in American tourists. So I guess it's looking at how to capitalize on that. But from the perspective that I come from in terms of decentralizing and also focusing across the whole year, it's also looking at the non-American market as well, that also contributing to a more established and stable year-long tourism offering. So great question.
Great. Aisha, do you want to add? Great. Maybe we have time for another round of questions?
Hi, my name is Felix, and I want to come back to the 10-year implementation plan, the Agenda 2063. Yeah. I'm also a student at LSE and happen to work for 2 years at the African Union. And so my question is, to what extent does the second 10-year implementation plan of the Agenda 2063 address the shortcomings of the first 10-year plan, and how realistic are its targets in light of the current political, economic and security challenges across the African continent? So it was interesting to hear what's your take on that.
Okay, thanks a lot. I think we're running out of time, but a quick question or comment. Go for it. Very quickly, last question.
Thank you. My name is Paul. I'm a part-time student here and work full-time in finance. My question or statement or comment, I think Maureen, you touched upon it, which was referring to the lack of integration amongst African regions and African countries within the AU. And I guess I wanted to hear everyone's perspective on how realistic do you think the integration that is required for the agenda can actually be achieved?
Oh gosh. Oh, you just had to go there, did you?
Great, okay, so fantastic panel. Who wants to start? Aisha.
I'm happy to take integration as a starting point, because
Please
I think we have different views. So I'm the optimist, I think.
Nice.
Maureen might be the realist between us. So let me take one step back, right? Which is again to reflect on the past and reflect on how much do we know about the infrastructure currently existing in African countries? Who's been looking at maps of African infrastructure recently? So this is like railways, roads, any map, any country, doesn't matter. Someone in the back. Huh? Someone else there, right? Okay. So a lot of infrastructure, well, I mean, I can speak about East African infrastructure because those are maps I've seen the most. A lot of infrastructure has been building on previously existing infrastructure, meaning that, you know, if you wanted a direct flight between two cities in Ghana, you'd need to start with the current infrastructure as your baseline. What's there now? You know, do you have an airport between point A and point B, right? What's the road network once I arrive at airport B? So we need to start with an acknowledgement of what is there. And unfortunately, I think for a lot of the African countries, what you see is an infrastructure deficit. So we are not only having this discussion from square one, we are starting it from, you know, we are far behind. And so we need to catch up a lot on the infrastructure deficit to reduce it in order for some of these aspirations to be met. But infrastructure is infrastructure. You know, it's not the most complicated thing to do. Of course, as Maureen pointed out earlier, not everything costs money, but a lot of things cost money. So that means that, you know, with every decision to expand infrastructure, there is a cost implication. Not only an economic cost implication, but even social implication, environmental implication, and all this needs to be taken into account. So what am I saying? Is the bottom line answer for me is regional integration is possible, it's achievable. The main limiting factor is at what cost, and to what extent can African countries, either individually or as regional blocks, or as African sort of union or continent in its entirety, meet the cost. And so that becomes a limiting factor. So of course then the practicality is that there has to be some prioritization, there has to be some sort of quick low-hanging fruits, some quick winners that governments have to make a decision about and prioritize. But it comes to something sort of slightly different, which is that needs a discussion, right? It needs, because now we are sort of trying to balance between national interests and national pursuits with regional, right, multi-country. So also that makes it a little bit complicated because perhaps governments want to have conversations that are net effect for the common good at a region or at an African level. That might have some tensions with what is good nationally, which I think would explain or would be one of the things to think about when not everybody is on the table. Yeah. That, you know, one reason could be that tension between national and regional and African objectives. So to conclude, yes, I'm a believer it's possible. I'm a believer it can be done. I'm just saying it can't all be done at once, but it can be done if there were pools of conversation where there was alignment and agreement on still a shared outcome. Yeah.
Well, on this optimistic note, I think it's time for us to end. Well, the path forward is going to be challenging, but there is definitely some optimism. The speakers are going to be around. If you have more questions, you feel free to ask them the questions later. Well, join me to give a warm round of applause to our fantastic speakers. Thanks a lot. Thank you very much.
This was such a fitting panel to end the entire conference. Thank you all once again for your contributions. Very insightful. Thank you.
Thank you.
Another round of applause for that.